My name is Jewel White. I'm Assistant Dean for Access and Multicultural Engagement in the Gies College of Business. And I want to welcome you and thank you to our final Black History Month event. So it's been great celebrating Black History Month. And we're extremely excited that you all have chosen to be here with us. I would also like to thank the Gies College of Business and the College of Education that have been supportive in our efforts to celebrate Black History Month. I want to thank Andrea Fierro, who is in the back, who is responsible for a lot of all the behind-the-scenes work that makes this possible. Also, Mariel Thompson, who is a superstar senior, who is our student facilitator. And last but not least, we are very fortunate to have Dean James Anderson here. James Anderson is Dean of the College of Education, the Edward William and Jane Marr Gutsgell Professor of Education, and an affiliate professor in the Department of History, African American Studies, and the College of Law at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. His scholarship focuses broadly on the history of U.S. education with a subfield in the history of African American education. His book, The Education of Blacks in the South, 1860 to 1935, won the American Educational Research Association Outstanding Book Award in 1990. He was elected to the National Academy of Education in 2008. In 2013, he was selected Center for Advanced Study Professor of Education at Illinois. And in 2016, he was awarded the AERA's Palmer O. Johnson Award for Best Article. The American Education Research Association awarded him the Presidential Citation in 2020, which is its highest award. And he was sworn into the Board of Trustees at Stillman College in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and inducted into the Stillman College Educator Hall of Fame. In 2021, he was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So we're very fortunate to have Dean Anderson here. So without further ado, I will turn it over.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean White, for that introduction. As you guys all heard, Dean Anderson has such an impressive background. So first I wanted to ask you if you could just take us back a little bit and talk about how you ended up in higher education, and more importantly, how did you end up at the University of Illinois?
Well, I will abbreviate that as much as I can because let me start when I first heard of Illinois. I know how Illinois think of itself as a world-class university, but in my spring semester of my senior year, a director of placement came to me and said, I have a program I want you to apply for. I didn't have a job at the time. I was finishing up a major in sociology. Fellow sociologists, you know how difficult it is to get a job with a BA degree. And so I've been interviewing for all kinds of things. And he said, I think I have the right thing for you. So, and I was out on campus where he saw me. So I said, what is it? He says, the University of Illinois has a program. It's a fellowship program, and it's designed for students who did not get an education degree in the undergraduate major. The purpose of it is to get and draw more people into teaching through a master's plus certification. So this program offers you a fellowship for a master's degree, and you'll be certified as a teacher. And I'm thinking, right. That was the first time I'd ever heard of the University of Illinois. I was born and raised in Alabama, and so was my parents and grandparents, great, and my family goes back when Alabama was a territory. And so my scope was very limited, and I knew every one of the historically black colleges because I was actually attending Stillman College, one of the historically black colleges in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And outside of that world, I did not know that many institutions, and for all kinds of reasons. University of Alabama is in the same town where I went to undergraduate, and it actually admitted Vivian Malone and James Hood at the end of my freshman year when they were admitted to the University of Alabama. And I knew a year before, 62, James Meredith was admitted to the University of Mississippi, and there were 2 people that were killed in the campus riot when he was admitted. And so I didn't pay that much attention to Alabama, even though it was in the same town. I had never thought about going to graduate school at the University of Alabama. I was a witness to Vivian Malone and James Hood. James Hood had to leave because of the harassment. He came back later to get his doctorate from the University of Alabama. But all my understanding and awareness of places for graduate school were limited. I had applied, I was about to apply to Atlanta University, which is a historically black college. They offered a master's degree in social work. So I thought that might be a possibility. So when he brought that to my attention, I thought, okay, I don't think this is realistic. And I was trying to imagine the University of Illinois, and I couldn't. I didn't know anyone out in the Midwest at all, no family or friends. But he kept after me, because I decided, okay, I hear you, and I kept moving. And the next day, he came and said, did you fill out the application? I said, oh, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. And I didn't do it. And he came every time he saw me. So I finally said, okay, let me get this placement director off my back. And I filled out the application to the University of Illinois, thinking that it would go nowhere. And about a couple of weeks after I had filed the application, I got, and here's something I know when young people won't even understand, I got a telegram. They don't even know what a telegram is. Saying that I had been admitted for the graduate program. And I was still not thinking that I was going to make that move. Still trying to, I'd never seen anything about the university, never seen it on television, anything like that. And most people wouldn't understand that Illinois would be censored on Alabama television because it was desegregated. Its football programs and basketball programs would not be shown in the state of Alabama because they had black players on the same team. Anything having to do with the university, even when the university might have been scheduled for an event, the state of Alabama would have censored it and not show it on its television. So other than that, I might have had a chance to see something about the University of Illinois on television. So I remember talking to my father, telling him I'd been admitted to the University of Illinois. And he spoke with familiarity that I didn't understand. He said, oh, that's Buddy Young's university. I don't think so. I don't. I said, the name Buddy Young didn't mean anything to me. Well, it turns out when he was in the Navy, Illinois had a top football team, and his #1 running back was an African American named Buddy Young, and they followed him. And so he was like, yeah, that's Buddy Young's university. Like, he didn't know anything more about the University of Illinois than Buddy Young, by the way. So finally I decided, okay, I'll take a chance. And I came out here for graduate study with the intention of getting a master's plus certification and then going back to Alabama. But as you now know, yes. It didn't work out that way. And I've been out here roughly ever since I came to graduate school that year. So that's how I found my way out here. In part, it was, if I'd had the opportunity to go to graduate school at the University of Alabama, I no doubt I would have taken it. That opportunity wasn't there. Alabama had never, at that time, had never graduated someone from that graduate school that was African American or person of color. And so you just knew, and plus what I knew about the segregation by Malone and Hood, no way am I going over there, because Vivian Malone was able to make it through. She already had a bachelor's degree when she enrolled at Alabama. She was much more mature than most undergraduate students. James Hood did make it through. He really had a mental breakdown because of all the harassment. You know, and we knew about it because Vivian Malone would tell us about it when she'd come to campus, and they wouldn't allow him to sleep, for instance. They assigned someone at all hours to make sure that he didn't get not an ounce of sleep. You know, and so it was that level of, it's like being in a torture chamber. And so he had a mental breakdown and he left. And so there was no way I'd even had a thought about going there. Illinois, turns out, was the only option that I considered. And so that's how I ended up at Illinois. Education, I didn't have an undergraduate major in education. It was in sociology, first mathematics, then sociology. And I ended up in education because the fellowship was designed for graduate study in education.
Wow. Well, thanks to your placement director and the fellowship program for bringing you here. So often in mainstream, the civil rights movement is kind of reduced to a simple matter of voting rights, which was a major aspect of the movement. But since the civil rights movement was so much more than that, can you just talk to us about the social and economic impact of the civil rights movement?
Yeah, I'll try to speak to that. It was a rights movement, and broad and complex, and it touched so many things. You know, the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed first, then the Voting Rights Act, and a lot of other acts like Title IX was modeled on Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Special education, there's so many things that were engendered by the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But I do want to point out, because I'm growing up in the cradle of the civil rights movement, my hometown, Greene County, Alabama, is next to Lowndes County and Selma and Montgomery, all of those places, Birmingham. I'm surrounded by that. And Martin Luther King was in Montgomery, and Shuttleworth was in Birmingham and Abernathy. These were names that we saw every day in the news. And you know, when I look back, they never used the term civil rights. It was, and it's interesting how, at some point, civil rights came to be the rubric for the movement. In all of the marches, I saw that there were three things you saw. One was freedom and equality were on the signs. They kept saying freedom and equality. They never said civil rights. And the other thing was jobs. You know, these were the principal aims of the movement: freedom and equality and jobs. But it touched on the full range of social opportunities. Education was a big part of it. Something that people probably didn't pay that much attention to, but it was an important case. The ban on interracial marriage didn't occur until 1967 in a Supreme Court case. That too was part of the freedom that was being championed in the movement. That all those kinds of restrictions on people because of race, there was an opposition across the board. Housing, jobs, opportunities, education, voting was just one of them. And it had an impact in all of these areas. I mean, 1968 was the passing of the Open House Ordinance Act was passed in 1968. There were so many things that were connected, and just remind me that once you start a rights movement, it just grows and expands. You know? And so, kind of like Reconstruction, another era of rights movement. You know, it was like the 14th Amendment might have been put into the Constitution in response to the Dred Scott decision, which said that African Americans were not citizens, and that the Constitution didn't apply. But once it was put in there, it applied to everybody. And when you think about all of the equal rights cases that go back to the 14th Amendment, well, it's hard to say that it was about one thing. It was about everything. Um, and, um, and that's, that's the way I feel. We would just say the movement. We never would say civil rights, because somehow it just ignored some aspects of it. And we also thought at the time that there was an important human rights component. And we kept telling each other if there was another country that was doing to its population what the U.S. was doing to African Americans in terms of Jim Crow, the assassinations, of Medgar Evers and Jimmy Lee Jackson and all of the people that were being shot because of the voter registration drives, that if that was happening in another place, America would not call it civil rights. They would call it human rights. And they would be cited, if this had been happening in China or some other place, the country would have been cited for a violation of human rights. And we understood that at the time, that this is, we're not sure how it got limited to civil rights when so much of it was really around human rights. But we do know, and in retrospect, it's quite, and we've kind of felt that way at the time, that it was going to touch on so many things. It was going to be much more complex than just voting rights. And that was just one component of it.
Absolutely. That's super powerful. So moving on, we know the stories of silent lunch counter sit-ins, but rarely do we hear about the Black-owned business landscape in the era and how they work to support the movement. So can you tell us about what the business scene was like for Black communities before the civil rights movement? What was the landscape leading up to the movement, and how the Black-owned business sector has fared since then?
Well, Black-owned business, particularly prior to the civil rights movement, was just embedded in the Black community in so many ways. How do I capture this? There were compelling reasons to avoid white business unless you had to go,
Right.
because it could lead to persecution or death, as in the case of Emmett Till. When he'd gone to a grocery store, and after going into the grocery store, was accused of being insubordinate or sassy or something like that, and was lynched. And so there were all these racial taboos that existed, and you knew that you could violate them the more you had interactions, whether it was around business or around social activities that involved you with the white population there. And growing up, I mean, Emmett Till grew up in Chicago, and so there was so much about the South that he didn't know, didn't understand, and don't forget James Baldwin, who was always profound about so many things. He participated in the March on Selma, and he was arrested 3 times in the same day. He was not trying to be arrested, but he grew up in New York City, and he just continued to violate the so-called unwritten rules, which most people don't know. It hasn't received attention. People look at legally mandated school segregation, or they look at bans on interracial. They look at the legal codes, and they were important, but the unwritten rules were so many. And also, most people who, quote unquote, were harassed or got in trouble usually was not violating the law, was a violation of unwritten rules. Even Rosa Parks had not violated the law, because the law said you had a line in the bus, and black people sit in the back, whites in the front. But the unwritten rule was that if the white section filled up, then black people had to get up and give a white person a seat. That wasn't the law, that was an unwritten rule. And so because you had all these unwritten rules, it was safe and comfortable and embracing to patronize black business. That's why you felt like a person, and you also felt you could do business without having to be humiliated, which often happened in that. And it's one thing I remember about coming here to Illinois, in Alabama. One of the taboos was there could be no touching, particularly between black males and white women. But in the stores, the white women tended to be the clerks, and run the registers and so forth. And so when you bought something, let's say something costs $4 and 45 cents, and they got to give you 55 cents change. Well, you couldn't allow her to touch your hand. That was a terrible taboo. So you had to hold your hand out and drop it so she could drop the change in your hand. So when I came here, these were instinctive habits, right? Because you're trying not to encounter the Ku Klux Klan. Mm-hmm. So I went to the store here, and the same thing happened. And I dropped my hand, and then she tried to catch my hand, and I dropped it again. I never forget, she looked at me, she says, "I do not have a disease." I mean, she was angry. She thought I was trying to avoid her for different reasons. And I'm looking at her like, I don't even have time to explain. And you don't have time to explain what is going on here. And no, you don't understand because you weren't raised in that environment. And so black businesses were the counter where you could go, shop, buy things. People knew you and respected you and so forth. And so the profits that came from those businesses on the part of black business owners, a lot of that fueled the civil rights movement. A lot of the money went into bail money for people who were arrested for no reason other than they were involved in voter registration drives. And the legal fees that were paid. They're the ones who had the money to pay the legal fees. And so the black business was right at the heart of the black communities, both in terms of not just funding the civil rights movement, helping to fund it, but what it meant for your safety, for your comfort, for your identity, for your integrity. That's what it meant. And that's why, I do understand the horror of Black Wall Street. They built 35 blocks where they could go and shop and be respected. I don't think people who didn't grow up there realize how much you were disrespected and humiliated just by going and being called a boy. I remember being in a store at Christmas time, and this white man comes in and he says, "I want 2 bags of those nigger toes." Do you know what he was asking for?
Can I guess licorice?
Huh?
Licorice?
No. Brazil nuts. And the clerk knew exactly what he was talking about and got 2 bags of Brazil nuts and said, "Here you go." Well, you're standing there and you're hearing this and there's nothing you can do about it. And so why would you want to go back there if there was a black business where you could get the same thing? Now, for so many things, you had to go to white-owned businesses. But when you didn't have to go, you wouldn't go.
Yeah, so it definitely came out of necessity, but also I think, as you mentioned, it just fueled so much into the civil rights movement in general. So moving forward, at Gies, we're taught that entrepreneurship fuels economic prosperity and serves as a bridge for low-income families to move up to middle-class status. Can you share with us your knowledge about the historic agreements that have been put into place that have prevented this upward mobility for most non-white folks, and specifically Black and African Americans?
Well, there are certain areas that are key. There's so many areas, as I was just sort of describing, where it impacts the lives of African Americans and other people of color as well. But jobs is like number 1 on the list. And that was always championed during the movement, jobs, because there were so many jobs you could not have, and the jobs that you did have you were so underpaid that it was difficult to make ends meet. Wages were so low. This was one of the interesting cases was the Head Start programs that moved in the 60s. And one moved into Mississippi. And the senators and congressmen from Mississippi wanted to have it abolished. It was interesting enough, they said the Head Start program was promoting segregation, as though Mississippi had been a fighter against segregation. What they were worried about is that the Head Start program was paying wages so much above the wages of Mississippi that it would create a serious revolt. And so they tried to shut it down so you couldn't see the wage differences. But it was difficult to accumulate wealth given the wages that were being paid at the time. Where I grew up in the agricultural economy, people were paid $2 a day for chopping cotton, 2 cents a pound for picking cotton. If you were the highest wage at $15 a week went to what they call yard boys. These were black men who took care of the landscape and so forth. That was the highest wage. Hardly anyone, and this is something that is like a class action suit that needs to go against the whole region. They pay people so little that they didn't have to pay Social Security. So when they got older, they didn't have Social Security. And for health care or anything else. And so it was like blocking all avenues to the accumulation of wealth. And so a lot of the inequalities rested in job discrimination, which, by the way, is not gone. There are contemporary studies of labor market discrimination that tells us it's still a problem and it's still profound. One of the studies was it's kind of an audit. This happened in Chicago and in Boston, where the social scientists sent out resumes to employers. And the resumes were the same in terms of where you graduated from college and the kinds of awards and accolades. That was the same. The only thing that was different, to one set of resumes, they attached the name Jamal, and to another set, they attached the name Keisha, and another set, they attached the name Brendan, and another set, Emily. And they measured the response rate. And Jamal and Keisha got significantly lower response rates just based on their name, not on the merits. Reminding us that there are a lot of employers that would not even respond to what they perceive to be an African-American name or a black-sounding name. Now, we know there's a certain amount of stereotyping there. I'm sure there's whites named Jamal and some named Keisha, but the stereotype is that when you hear Jamal and Keisha, that the holders of those names are likely to be black, and Brendan and Emily. So, and then there's another study out recently on jobs where they discovered that African American, Latino, and Asian graduates today will whiten their resume so that employers can identify their ethnicity. And they do things, so many. One example was when she was applying, she had attended Hampton for a little while, and she took Hampton off of her resume because they knew that the employers would be able to see that Hampton was a historically black college. One interesting one, that was Jose, who was applying for jobs online, and he couldn't get any response, and on a hunch, he just dropped the S and said Joe, and all of a sudden his box was filled with responses from employee seeking the interview. So we still have that. It wasn't not as blatant, it's more institutionalized now, but back during the era of quote unquote the civil rights movement, it was just bold and blatant. You can't work here, you can't work there. These jobs are reserved for whites only. And so it prevented the accumulation of wealth, and that becomes intergenerational. As you know, for the middle class, much of that wealth is in home equity. They couldn't buy homes. And when there was government support for the purchase of homes through the FHA, African Americans were excluded. And they had this sort of showcase out in Long Island where FHA gave loans, and that's when they switched from having to, I don't know, pay 50, 70, 80% down for a house where you could pay, 20% down or something like that, and enable these large communities to develop because of government support. And I'll never forget, I was watching an interview with Bill O'Reilly and Obama, and Bill O'Reilly said, the difference between the two of us is that you are a nanny state guy, meaning that you look for government handouts. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. It just so happened he was born in that community where the government gave them handouts so that they could purchase homes. And then those homes and the equity was handed down through generations. There was no recognition that there were other Americans who were denied that opportunity, and that denial becomes intergenerational. And it prevents accumulation of even the basic kind of wealth that comes from ownership. And so job discrimination has been there, was there, and continues to be there. And it literally has not gone away and continues to affect a lot of people of color. I think also the larger impact that you get, you said earlier about black businesses, their growth was limited because the lending companies and the places where you get capital, they were cut off from that. And there have been a lot of studies showing how the loan companies are discriminated against people of color. Other thing was, even if you got something, let's say you got a home, then there's this other discrimination that comes with it. There's a case now going to the Department of Justice. African-American couple, they own the home. They had it appraised. They got the appraisal and they thought, this seems awfully low. So he said, okay. They had a white friend to stand in to appraise the same home. $500,000 more in appraisal. So even if you're fortunate enough to get something like a home, the wealth that you would normally accrue gets limited because appraisal, it corresponds, it's so closely corresponded to race and things like that. Another case it made the African American woman feel really bad. She's an attorney, and she had the same kind of appraisal, and she detected what was going on. So she had to take all the pictures out of her home, of her son, her children, her parents, herself, anything that gave the appraisal a sense that it was connected to an African American. Now, that's humiliating, and she admitted that it was humiliating to have to take down the picture of her young son so that the appraiser wouldn't see it. And again, when they had a white couple, her husband, who was white, by the way, he stayed, put up pictures of his family, and he was there for the appraisal. She wasn't there for the appraisal. And it went up $250,000 on that. Well, I think most people don't even imagine this kind of discrimination actually impacting the wealth of a community, but it does. It says it's difficult to get the capital to purchase a home because of job discrimination, employment discrimination. And if you're so fortunate to get one, you're not done with facing other forms of discrimination and that actually limit the wealth that you might gain. And so those kinds of discriminations, and we you know, and it's hard to know what kind of efforts that you can make to change that. One study that I use it was done 2019 in Long Island, and they had these testers and these undercover cameras where people go in and try to buy homes and listen. And they went through 90 agents, real estate agents, almost 6,000 listening. And what they would do is to have an African American, a Latina, go in, so they want to buy a home. And then they would have the camera to record the interaction and how they would show them homes and what they would do. And you watch that. And this is 2019, and the discrimination, when they tabulated discrimination, they said that Asian Americans were discriminated against 19% of the time. Latinx was discriminated against 33% of the time. And African Americans were discriminated against 49% of the time. And the discrimination occurred like the same real estate agent, African American would go in and want to buy a home, and they would say, oh, this place here is a nice place to stay. And I love showing this to someone. And then the white person working with the same, it's called Newsday, was the press that was doing it, would come in next, and they said, you don't want to live in that neighborhood. You don't want your kids going to those schools, and that's, you don't want to be around when the crack dealer comes. So it was steering whites to an entirely different neighborhood, and yet claiming to be excited by an African American to show them are listed in the same neighborhood. And this was 2018 when they documented that. Well, where they show your home, the neighborhood in which you purchase, all has much to do with the value of the home and the accumulation that comes with equity. We're not out of the woods on that. And these were things that were recognized during the movement of the 1960s. It was part of what they fought against, this kind of discrimination, because they lived it on an everyday basis. And they knew the difficulty of one getting a loan, and if you got a loan, buying a home, and if you bought a home, then trying to to capitalize on the wealth that you normally would that comes with equity in real estate.
Absolutely, yeah. It's crazy to hear those stories. I remember reading that appraisal story in the news just a few months ago, and it's clear definitely that the implicit biases and covert racism that started this problem are still, apparent today. With that being said, in a recent report, Citigroup estimated that the economy would see a $5 trillion boost over the next 5 years if the U.S. were to tackle key areas of discrimination against African Americans. What, in your opinion, has prevented the U.S. from actively dismantling policies that would eliminate current disparities and systematic inequality and expand access to opportunity to all Americans?
Well, I think in part, not wholly, but in part, as a nation, we concede a lot to private ownership. And we have some very important politicians who don't believe we should ever intervene. I remember a conversation with a senator from Kentucky, and they asked him a simple question about the lunch counter demonstrations and the sit-ins, and he didn't think that government should have interfered. That's private business, and so we do have that long-standing tradition of conceding a lot, even when, in the case of the Long Island housing, the government was actively involved and loaning the money to get it, but then would step back and say, let private ownership have its way. And so I think that's a significant part of knowing. We'll see what happens when this case goes through the Department of Justice. Will the Department of Justice says, you can't do that, you can't discriminate against people like that? Or will it take what has been tradition and say, oh, that's private ownership, we should own it? And we're seeing this with Hobby Lobby and with protests against all kinds of things that concede to private ownership. And so the extent to which we say they can have their way, this won't change. And examples in housing, and it goes from housing to retail. I mean, there was, when I used the video True Colors, one of the segments had to do with just buying a used car. And they, again, have these testers that they audit. The white guy and the audit goes in to buy a car, And the guy tells them what's going to be the price, what's going to be the interest rate, what's going to be the down payment. And no sooner than he leaves, they have the African American to go in and ask for the same car with the same dealer, and everything shoots up. And then at the end of this, they point out that African Americans pay in excess of $152 million a year because of the markups based upon the color of their skin. And when I learned that, I thought, wow, in 10 years, that's $1.5 billion. How many scholarships could that pay for? And yet, there's nothing to stop it. It goes on the next day. Same thing is true in housing and other places where by either paying more or losing when you get an appraisal, that adds up. And so, yes, I could see how that kind of discrimination could add up to a $5 trillion loss. And if you eliminated it, it could make a big difference in terms of, and the same thing with what the government tried to do with black farmers and the first kind of infrastructure package, or I forget what name they put on it, but there were funds for black farmers. And now they're suing as reverse discrimination. But they, for so many decades, so many centuries, black farmers were cheated out of their land, couldn't get loans, faced this kind of discrimination. Excuse me. So how does the government respond is the question. Do you let it continue, or do you put in triggers that change it? And that can. One of the things that came out of the quote-unquote civil rights movement was institutional racism. It was corn in the movement. It grew out of the movement. And I was actually an undergraduate when I heard then Stokely Carmichael, later Kwame Ture, actually coined the term institutional racism. And in a way, chastising us because he said, you're too concerned about George Wallace and his using the N-word. You're too concerned about these racial epithets and this overt stuff. He said, you ought to be focused on the infant mortality rate in the hospitals in Alabama. You ought to be focused on the inequality in schools throughout the state of Alabama. And so he made a successful effort to refocus the attention on institutional racism. And then he published a book in 1967, Black Power, and with Charles Hamilton, a political science where it was defined. And then the following year, sociologists Joe Fagan and Clarice Booth Fagan published a book called Discrimination American Style, Institutional Racism and Sexism. And they reminded us, that to end discrimination requires organizational change. And so institutional racism was defined as routine organizational practices that have an adverse and disproportionate impact on communities of color. Not so much the name calling, but just the regular routine stuff. And that's why it's difficult to reverse it. And they had all kinds of examples that you can reverse. I remember one that just stood out. At the time, California had a regulation for becoming a police officer in the state of California. And the regulation was you had to be 6 feet or taller to be a police officer. The justification for the regulation was that tall people could command a greater presence on the street and disperse trouble situations. Well, there was no proof of that. And when they did do a study, it was the demeanor and the character of the person, not the height of the person. But if you look at average heights across gender and ethnicity, you can see how this organizational practice had an adverse and disproportionate impact on communities. And they eliminated that. And there are a lot of things in routine business where, if they were eliminated, would allow access and opportunities for people who are discriminated against. And even the university as well. I mean, think about this. One of the more decisive things, as you know, of getting into this university is what? Test score, right? I mean, we might say we don't have a fetish for it, but we do. Now, what have we had recently? What we've had recently is test optional. So a large segment of our freshman class do not take the tests, right? So now you got what you might call a control group, right? Those who take the tests, those who do not take the tests. Will we have any proof that those who did not take the test perform less well? I don't know. They haven't studied it yet, right? But there's an opportunity there, right? It's a course completion, their retention and graduation rates. Are they similar? Or are they vastly different or sufficiently different as to justify, yeah, we do need the test? Well, there are all kinds of mechanisms that operate daily in an organizational, and that people who study organizational change, and that's business, right? Nobody studies organizational, yes, your major. Nobody studies organizational change and behavior like the field of business. There's an important role that look at routine organizational practices in corporation and institutions, other institutions, to say, you know, this is keeping people out, having an adverse disproportionate impact on these communities, and there may not be any need for this trigger or for this lever. We might be able to eliminate this, that would give other people a chance. And I always think about, I don't know if they still do it, but they used to have, you know, just good jobs here in the university where you janitors and you know, you clean the floors, you get other. And when you looked at the pay, you know, maybe not anything to boast about, but you looked at the health care and the health benefits and the retention, and you go, that's not bad. That's a good job, right? But it used to be, in order to get that job, you had to pass a civil service exam to get it. And you have to ask the question, how much testing do you need to do the work that's required? And if you don't need the test, then can we find some other way of opening up employment opportunities? Because we already know who's going to score low on the tests. We already know, and we've been studying test spots for a long time, but is it necessary in every case? Yeah. There may be cases, like, I don't know, I'm not an expert, like the bar exam or the medical exam. There may be cases where you say, no, we don't want anybody practicing law or practicing medicine unless they pass this test. But there are a lot of things out there that just preclude populations from having equal access. And it should be a close and careful study. Part of this could be the Department of Justice or Office of Civil Rights, because they do have the capacity to do this. I've served as an expert witness in federal DSEC case, and I've served when the Department of Justice is on the side of the plaintiffs, and I've served when the Department of Justice was on the side of the state. And believe me, it makes a huge difference when you have the backing of the Department of Justice, just in terms of their resources and capacity. They can make a big difference. And we'll see what happens with this case.
Looking forward to it. I know my 17-year-old self would have definitely preferred not to be taking the SAT. So with that being said, I'm going to pass it to Kiesia, who's going to moderate the Q&A portion of our event today, and just give you all the opportunity to ask any questions to Dean Anderson on what we discussed today, or just on the general topics of the talk.
So when you talk about coming here to the University of Illinois, I know that even this campus had a long history of racial segregation as far as living quarters and dining and things like that. What was the environment when you arrived here? And it sounds like you would describe it as better than what it was for you in Alabama. But was there still
It's a good question because I would say it had just ended when I arrived, and they were phasing into a different and new kind of environment. What I learned, and I didn't know it at the time because in my first semester I would see graduates, alums who were coming back, and in the house that I was advisor, graduate advisor, they were stopping in, and they would say, "I'll be right back. I got to go and talk to my family in the community." And I thought, wow, these are really some wonderful graduates. They got such strong connections to the community. Turned out that's why they had to live in the community when they were students, because they couldn't live in the residence hall on campus. Now, it had just changed when I arrived, and I met students here, African American students in particular, who had come a few years earlier, and they could not get a space. And later, when I would actually, my field is history of American education, look at questions like that, I was able to document that, not that I was writing an article on it, but saw the evidence that 1948, the Chicago Defender, their front page was that this university allows 2 African American women to live in Busey Hall for the first time since it had been established in 1867. And so that was this long history. And again, that was another one of these sort of institutional racist kind of practices, is that we could admit you, but if you don't have a place to stay, you might not be able to come. And I discovered at one point there were more black students enrolled here from Missouri than the state of Illinois. And you go, why? Well, St. Louis had this very famous black public high school, Sumner High, which was the first black public high school west of the Mississippi. And the university knew that all of its graduates were African American because Missouri was under the Jim Crow system. So they could count on that. They weren't so sure about some of the African Americans who were graduating from different places in the state and get assigned housing. And then they arrived and go, oops, we didn't mean to assign you housing in the residence hall. And so I thought, what an irony that you'd have more black students from the state of Missouri than you would from the state of Illinois, because you could count on Missouri, Jim Crow. You could count on Missouri's Jim Crow. And so it had just ended, when I arrived, because there were no barriers to African American students living in the residence hall when I arrived. But it was only recent that had happened. And there were still people around who had gone to school here, and a couple of guys were coming back. They were professional football players. They had played football here, and they were going out into the Champaign-Urbana community to visit with the families where they stayed when they went to school here. And this was not just Illinois. This was, Ohio State. Jesse Owens could not stay on campus, even as they praised him for defeating the Nazis in the 100 meters dash, but he couldn't stay on the campus at Ohio State. So a lot of these institutions did not have, and the interesting thing about it, again, institutional racism come back into place because the state of Illinois had passed a law, and the U of I Board of Trustees had passed a regulation barring any discrimination based on race or creed or national origin, things like that. These laws were already in place, but the university then created its own institutionalized system of housing discrimination that I actually met a person who was the victim of that. And so I said, well, how, because she had graduated from a high school in the suburban area. They didn't know she was black. And she arrived in the residence hall, and they saw her and said, no, why don't you wait over here? We need to, they said they had to do something. They had to work something out. And she said she was sitting there. And finally the African-American woman came through the door and said, okay, you got to go with me. She'd never seen her before. She says, why do I have to go with you? And so they said, well, there's something there's a problem with your housing registration, or straighten it out. Well, she thought it was just temporary, so she went back the next day. And she said they told her that she wasn't qualified to live in a residence hall. And they used the term qualified. They never said you can't live here because you're black. Yes, you're not qualified. And that is a very, very coded and profound term, particularly in the North. We never say you can't live here because of the color of your skin. We say you're not qualified. And I was teasing at the time. What kind of qualifications? I said, I know people who live in these halls. What kind of qualifications do you need to live in a residence hall? And of course, we both knew what they meant when they said she wasn't qualified. But that was changing as I came in. I caught winds of it, and then finally they produced the video, Home of Their Own, if you haven't seen it. But it's on the U of I webpage that documents that whole history of African Americans being forced to live in community and also to eat. When we applied to the federal WPA for the Illini Union, because it's a federal funded building, one of the justifications we used was that it would be the only place in campus town that African American students could eat. Hey. Uh-huh. Okay. Yeah. I think the first part of the question, how did they get the capital to start these businesses in the first place? One, there were some black businesses, including banks, that could loan to a very few individuals, not that many. And I remember growing up in Alabama, A.G. Gaston was, and his bank in Birmingham, and we knew that there was A.G. Gaston. He's a millionaire. He has a bank, and there was insurance companies. I think one was called the Booker T. Washington Insurance Companies. Well, these were companies with capital that some African Americans could go to get capital to start business. The other thing is that it was always uneven. There were some people who came out of slavery, inheriting land, and then keeping that land as long as they could and using that land. And then, the fundraising process, which I've studied in the field of education in the African American community, where people pooled their money to build schools, pooled their money to help business get off the ground. But that would only be for a few people. Now, there were some where the owners were black. I mean, the operating owners were black, but the capital owners were white, running business in the African American community. But I think most of these were the individuals who had inherited a little bit in terms of land. These were farmers, black farmers, who could take some of the capital that they earned and then put that into a business. And it's not that, not that there were black Wall Streets everywhere, like in Tulsa, but in community after community, think about it, if there was a lawyer, attorney, that did the whole black community, this was the only place that you could go to for an attorney, a dentist, a doctor. These were the people who received all of the African American business And some of them was able to earn enough to turn some of that capital into their own business as well. So there were a few businesses. Yeah, not that many, but there were a few businesses that, now in some places like Birmingham, that's different. There's a lot of businesses in Birmingham. And you know, it had a different kind of community, different size, lot more business, lot more, even as high schools were, you know, when I think about, you know, Angela Davis coming out of there and Condoleezza Rice coming out of there and Freeman Rabowski, who, you know, they just had the size and the resources to do what you couldn't do in small towns, like the one that I grew up in. We just had kind of a local person here and there. Restaurants, for instance, if you were going to go out and get a sandwich and listen to a rockola, you'd better go to that business owned by black people, because if you strayed out, you could get into serious trouble. And you say, how are we doing today, was the latter part of it. It's still a struggle to get capital to start businesses. That is something, since we have documented research on the kinds of discrimination that occur, you know, it's something that the Department of Justice ought to take up as to not only why they discriminate against communities of color, but also how they're doing it. Because the important thing is change the behavior and to be able to monitor the behavior for accountability and responsibility, and not just let it run wild.
Have another round of applause for Dean Anderson.